Families, Teamsters, 1932.org.
All right, good evening. Welcome to the Farron Dozier Show on KCAA Radio, 106.5 FM, 1050 AM. Also streaming from the KCAA Radio.com website and MBRradio.us. We got to bless the show before we get started. Let's go. When I was in my mother's womb, I had a calling on my life to do something in the glory of God and marry it like a wife. Commit myself to his word and never be led astray. And when it's all over, when he comes, I'll be glad to see that day in the morning time. All right, good evening and welcome to the Farron Dozier Show on KCAA Radio, 106.5 FM, 1050 AM. Also streaming from the KCAA Radio.com website, the station that leaves no listener behind. Check this out. If you're in your car and you're driving in the Inland Empire, you got to get out. Make sure you go grab your device or go download the app, the KCA Radio. Yep, we got an app. Download the app, and you can catch us right there from your device if you are having to get out of your ride. So make sure you go check us out. And also check out all the other talk shows on the network. You can find some other interesting conversations to listen to as well. All right, so tonight, as always, we have a very, very important conversation for you. Today's episode is brought to you by What's the Count on Sickle Cell Trait Prevention, also known as WDC on SCT. You can go to the Instagram page at WDC on SCT, on the X page as well, and WDC Radio on Facebook, and catch out and check out all the conversations that I've been doing the last, 15 years almost around sickle cell trait. This conversation is very, very important for our community here in the Inland Empire, but also because we're on the internet, we are globally, so it is a global conversation. Tonight I got a special guest that we're going to kick off this episode with. He and I are not strangers. He was actually on the MB Radio, that's right, the Military Broadcast Radio network that I'm on Wednesdays at 4 p.m. You can catch me over there. Go to mbradio.us and get that app too, or watch us on Roku TV. But I do my military talk shows on that platform, and my guest tonight, Cyrus, was on there just maybe, I don't know, earlier this year possibly. He was there. But tonight I invited him on to be a part of the question of the week as we talk about sickle cell trait, as known as the silent killer, right? And so the sickle cell trait being labeled as a silent killer is because, well, you're going to find out. So that's why you got to stay tuned, right? So I want you to listen in. After we're done sharing with him, then I'm going to come back and I'm going to share with you some of the key points around why it's the silent killer. And then if you have questions, you can reach out to me. I'm on all the platforms at Farron Dozier. So with no further ado, let's just bring on Cyrus right now. You're live with What's the Count?
How you doing?
What's happening, man?
Oh, man, I'm grateful.
Man, thank you. Thank you for the short notice of being a guest tonight, man. I know you have got to get some rest and stuff, but I really appreciate you, man, for helping me share this part of this conversation to start of the show. So do me a favor and introduce yourself to the listeners.
All right, well, my name is Cyrus Cunningham. I am a survivor, I would say. I do have sickle cell anemia trait. And, yeah, I'm just trying to play my role and contribute a little bit into just being an advocate as well.
Yeah, no, man. Again, thank you for that introduction. And like I said, we've had a conversation before. He has shared his story about his sickle cell trait experience with rhabdomyolysis, which is one of our other important conversations that I share from with that same experience. So, man, before we answer the question, and since our last interview, what do you want to say about sickle cell trait today, as far as your knowledge and research and where you are with it at today?
Oh wow, man. Get your labs done. Stay aware. Learn as much as you can, but stay consistent in getting blood work done. Don't blow it off and act like it's just nothing.
Yeah, man. Thank you. Thank you for that, because the lab work is the only way you can find out if you have sickle cell trait. And again, as we're going to cover tonight, the title of it being the silent killer. So my question for tonight, man, is what myths have you heard about sickle cell trait, even before you and I started communicating? What are one of the myths that you had heard about sickle cell trait?
Well, other than cramping, that most people feel fine. They have no issues, that they don't have to worry about anything, and that is not true whatsoever.
Yeah, that is one of the conversations that we definitely is a myth. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add that it ties into what we were talking about before with rhabdo, and I mean, some of the same environment, the same symptoms basically could cause some of the same issues. Blood and urine, different things like that. So it's, just staying away from heat and understanding dehydration and extreme exercise just runs hand in hand. And for some people to think some of those symptoms are just something temporary, or that can just be just remedied, that's why it's so important for you to get blood work.
Yeah, Cyrus, man, thank you. Like I said, for being a part of the first part of this episode and sharing the question of the day with me, man. And is there anything else you want to say before I let you go?
Not necessarily. I mean, I understand some people think that it's just something that most African Americans have, and I mean that's a myth as well. But Hispanic, Middle Eastern folk, Mediterranean descent, Indian. So I mean, there's people all across the boards that can have it as well.
No, thank you for that too.
It.
That's it. But that's a key point, because it is Hispanic Heritage Month, and so the Latin community is number 2 with sickle cell trait. So they have about 1 out of 100 babies are born with sickle cell trait, and 1 out of 36,000 are born with sickle cell anemia or disease. So, and San Bernardino County and Riverside County, and of course LA County, we're all blended, and so large populations of our Hispanic and Latin descent. So it is a very important conversation for my community. So I appreciate you for pointing that out.
Yes, sir. Of course. I thank you for having me.
Yeah, man. Thank you for taking time out tonight, man. Like I said, I really appreciate you for the notice, man, and hanging in there with me tonight.
My pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a great night.
All right. Thank you. Again, this is the Farron Dozier Show on KCAA Radio 106.5 FM and 1050 AM. We are going to play a public service announcement. You might recognize the voice. I'm gonna let the engineer play the PSA just so you can hear it for yourself, and then I'll come back and share how I got that PSA completed. But this is the Farron Dozier Show on KCAA Radio. We're talking about sickle cell trait, the silent killer, right here on KCAA Radio, NBC affiliate sports, NBC News, and NBC News. Charlotte, West County.
Hey, I'm Curtis Blow, the legendary rapper and pastor, and I support WDC on SCT, and that's What's the Count on Sickle Cell Trait Awareness. Now, it's not just sickle cell anemia that can cause complications, but the sickle cell trait can cause sudden death if the body overheats from physical exertion or high levels of stress. So it's not too late to get tested for the sickle cell trait and learn more about the silent killer. It's not just in African Americans, y'all. So follow the WDC on Twitter at WDCONSCT. That's Twitter at WDCONSCT.
Welcome back to the Farron Dozier Show on KCA Radio 106.5 FM, Temple AM. I hope you was able to hear that. I'm actually calling in live from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm out here visiting my family, so I'm not in the studio. So if you go to kcaradio.com, you might catch an image of the show banner tonight. But that PSA that you heard was Curtis Blow. Yes, the legendary rapper and pastor Curtis Blow. I was able to meet him back in late 2009 into 2010. And, you know, the power of social media. I met him on Twitter, and I reached out to him because I had a song a song idea. I wanted What's the Count on Sickle Cell Trait, my sports band, What's the Count, to have a theme song. And if you remember his song, Rapping Basketball, from back in the day, I actually have some bars of him doing the current version of that in 2010. So that's also something that I have. But what I did was when I was in communication with him and I thought about doing the PSA, I reached back out to him before the song was complete, and I asked him if he would record a PSA for me supporting WDC on SCT. And when I got to his house, I had written out what I wanted him to say, and that's what you just heard. So yes, that is the original Curtis Blow, the rapper and pastor, supporting sickle cell trait and addressing it as a silent killer. Sickle cell trait is not sickle cell disease, but sickle cell trait has its own awareness, education, and prevention conversations. And if you've been tuning in the last start of September, you've heard me go over some of these conversations on how important sickle cell trait is. So we're going to get into the first part of tonight's episode around the talk, as you heard the question answered tonight. But I got some key points I want to drop with you on the episode and just kind of just give you some awareness. This is just some basic awareness as I'm a patient advocate for my cause. But this is our week 3 session. And you know, why is sickle cell trait, also known as SCT, and you might see it on the medical documentation as HbAS, which is hemoglobin, and the A is your adult hemoglobin, and the S is the trait. It is known as the silent killer because, as Cyrus was saying earlier, people just are not aware of sickle cell trait and the risk factors. And the risk factors really have not been addressed. They are a public health issue. And if you've been listening to the show since I've been here since 2021, that has been one of my main conversations and is still a very important topic. You know, with sickle cell trait, 1 in 12, 1 in 13 African Americans have sickle cell trait. All right, because it has a purpose in life, it combats malaria. But today we're breaking the silence, so people are not caught off guard. We want people to know their status. We want people to find out that they're carriers. And so, you know, my personal piece of this conversation is I didn't find out I was a sickle cell trait carrier until my 10th year in the Army. That means I joined 10 years previously with my initial physical at MEPS, and my sickle cell trait was not identified. It wasn't until my second physical 10 years later I was transferring to Alpha 125 FIBA, and as a supply sergeant, and I did my physical at the LA Air Force Base because that was the closest hospital to where I was stationed at. And the Air Force Base officer, medical, they found my sickle cell trait through my blood work. And they literally called me in a panic. Like, I got a phone call from the clinic, the doctor, he was like, you need to come back to the clinic. I need to talk to you. And I'm thinking that he must have found something else, some STD. I don't know what he found. So I go back, I rush back to the clinic, and he asked me if I knew I was a sickle cell trait carrier. And I told him I wasn't. I didn't know. And immediately I thought about my cousin, Nigel, who has sickle cell anemia. And so I was like, hey, I have a cousin with sickle cell. He's like, no, you're not sickle cell disease. You're just a carrier. And being a carrier, your only concern is making sure that you don't mate with another person that has sickle cell trait, because you can have a baby with sickle cell disease. And that's all I was told. No brochure, no pamphlet, no other information, just the basic of that. Make sure you don't mate with another person because you can have a baby with sickle cell disease. And that was it. So in one ear, out the other, and I was going about my business in transferring to my next duty station, and never thought anything about it until 2010. So this is 1999, and then I was reminded I was a trait carrier in 2010, but I had already collapsed in 2006. So that was quite a bit of time in between that I did not know that my experiences that I was having was connected to my sickle cell trait, right? And so not until I had a conversation with, at the time, Lieutenant Adams, who was my platoon leader, and I was platoon sergeant on our deployment together. We ran the POL company for Alpha 40th, and we never talked about that conversation. We didn't even know to have a conversation about that until that day in 2010 when I saw him, and he asked me how I was because I was in so much pain and I could barely walk. I told him what happened, and he was like, "Oh, my muscles locked up on me, but I have sickle cell trait." And just in that conversation made me think about my physical back in 1999. And so this is why these conversations are so important, because maybe I could help someone remember or trigger a thought or remember a blood test that they had, or remember that their mom had told them when they were little that they were a sickle cell trait carrier. So that's why the conversation is so important. And it's not that the silent killer, is to be afraid of. It's more being able to just know your status and have this awareness protect you, right? And give you some knowledge of what to take care of around your health, right? So often people don't know that the symptoms that they have are connected to sickle cell trait, right? And so I can tell you that my mom would tell you that since I was 2 years old, I had pain in my left arm. And in 1975, they took me to the doctor, and they said that I had growing pains, right? Because they weren't doing any kind of newborn screening back then in the 70s. And again, with my pain symptoms as a child, it made sense. Oh, well, he's growing, he's 5, it's growing pains, he'll be fine. Well, at the age I am today, 50 years later, I'm still having the same pain in the same arm, and it didn't go away. And then I collapsed. So the silent killer it has caused sudden death in some people who were sickle cell trait carriers. And silent because there was no conversation. There was a lack of knowledge, right? And I used to say, I'm out to disappear the ignorance, and usually when you call somebody ignorant or you talk about something ignorant, it's a derogatory statement. But if you look at the definition of ignorant, it just means lack of knowledge. So at best, as a patient advocate for sickle cell trait awareness, education, and prevention, the best that I could do is plant the seed of awareness. And that is really why I'm on the radio. That's, part of the reason why I've been on the radio for the last 15 years is to ensure that this conversation is had, if not by anyone else. I'm not relying on the government systems to have this conversation. I'm relying on the message that God has given me because I was born with this gene, right? So when you talk about being silent, I can't. Yes, I could have taken that experience and stayed in the dark and cried and been upset and woe is me with it, right? Which is not wrong, which people probably wouldn't question because of my experience with it, but I found that it was very important as a conversation. There's so many different stigmas, so many different myths, and we're out to just really address this part of it. We want people to know that they could be having symptoms before it's too late. And the too late piece is because, again, people have died and collapsed, have had very severe injuries from sickle cell trait exertion with the rhabdomyolysis, or sometimes it's just sickle cell trait by itself because it's not benign. And most people just live their normal life, a day to day with no symptoms, right? I never put two and two together that my trait pain in my arm and when I collapsed was all connected. I didn't know that even at the time when I collapsed, that the being diagnosed with rhabdomyolysis was my first diagnosis, that the sickle cell trait wasn't even a thought about. It wasn't even a conversation when I collapsed and went to the Twin Cities Hospital. Like none of that was there. But a lot of times it doesn't express itself until it's under extreme stress, intense exercising, dehydration, high altitude, heat. It shows up like heat stroke. The doctor, when I collapsed that morning, after he saw my kidneys, he just told me I might have some kidney problems, but other than that, he came back and was like, "Oh, you just probably dehydrated heat stroke. So we're going to give you another IV." I had 2 IVs that morning, and they sent me on my way. But I was still dying on the inside that day. I got worse. So again, it doesn't really show up until the body is under stress. You could be dehydrated, and most people walk around dehydrated. You're supposed to drink half your body weight in ounces of water per day to avoid dehydration. Half your body weight in ounces of water per day to avoid being dehydrated. And so most, I won't say most, but there's a great percentage of us who walk around already dehydrated. You go into the gym exercising, you're working out, and you're already dehydrated because you haven't replaced that water. And depending on what else you've been drinking, sodas, coffee, alcohol, those don't hydrate you. They actually can cause a level of dehydration. So you have to drink extra water if you're drinking sodas and coffee and alcohol to get that stuff out of your system because of those chemicals, right? So this means that many carriers have no warning before the crises, like the exertional sickling with the rhabdo, as I shared. And if the people around them don't know of what the person is experiencing, then it can lead to sudden death if they're not seeking medical attention for the symptoms of what the person is having. So that's the first part of this conversation. I just wanted to touch on that. It's really, really important about sickle cell trait and it being called the silent killer. Just a lot of times it's been overlooked. And I'm not going to say, because it's a black gene that it's overlooked. We're going to get into that stigma and myth later on. But for the most part, the awareness, the knowledge of it has been just make sure you don't make another person because they could have, or you could have a baby with sickle cell disease. There are some stigmas, there are some myths, as we've shared tonight, and we're going to get into more of those over the weeks of this broadcast to talk about more of those issues that people, they don't know if they're true or not. All right, that's what a myth is. Is it true, or is it a myth and it's just been told that could happen? But it's definitely some complications to it. You can visit WDCONSCT.org for more information. You can go to our Instagram page at WDCONSCT. Again, this is my purpose in life. This is my activity of life. So you can find, if you Google Farron Dozier, you'll find lots of conversations, like I said, over the last 15 years, from Blog Talk Radio to LA Talk Live, to LA Talk Radio, to Morris Media Studios, and now here at KCA Radio, and other interviews that I've probably done on other platforms throughout the years and conferences. So you'll definitely find some information if you pull up my name. We're going to play another PSA, and we'll come back and I'll touch on some more aspects of the silent killer known as sickle cell trait in the community. This is the Farron Dozier Show on KCAA Radio, 106.5 FM and 1050 AM. Shout out West.
Hey, I'm Sergeant First Class Farron Dozier. I'm here at the military base, and I have the sickle cell trait. Now, why I got involved is I experienced what they call sickle cell trait exertion. And I was doing the Army physical fitness test, the 2-mile run, and when I got done, I collapsed. A lot of soldiers and athletes have been dying at football fields and running track, and the family members have no idea that they have the sickle cell trait gene or that it's a trigger. So my purpose is to mobilize the community so we can find out what's in your genes. How will life be if we could prevent another child from being born with sickle cell trait or disease? And if a child was born with the trait or disease, that the family members would have the education, awareness, and resources in every city that they lived in. So tune into our webinar series and find out what's the count. What's the count? What's the count? What's the count?
All right, welcome back to the Farron Dozier Show on KCAA Radio, 106.5 FM and 1050 AM. Again, streaming from the KCAA.com website. If you want more information about sickle cell trait, is our conversation tonight, visit WDCONSCT.org. That was actually my first PSA that you just heard. I was still in the military at the time. I had just produced my sports brand, What's the Count, and saw that it was an important conversation, and we recorded that PSA at the Armory. If you watch it on the video, I'm at the Armory that I used to work at back then, and I'm very blessed to again have that PSA done. Back then, when I started, there weren't anything that I saw that had a public service announcement around sickle cell trait, and so when I saw that I could become this advocate, and I found my voice, that life wasn't over, I was able to, start to address my experience and share with people the importance of this conversation. When I did my research in 2010, I saw that, people have been dying and collapsing for years from sickle cell trait in the military, to the point that the military screening, they were screening for sickle cell anemia, but you could join with sickle cell trait. So you can still join the military with sickle cell trait. You can join the Air Force, you can join the Army, Navy, Marine, Coast Guard, because they test for those inherited genes. The Army wasn't testing for the sickle cell trait as an identifier, only sickle cell anemia. I can tell you today, in 2025, the military, the Army, has been retesting soldiers starting back in 2020. So I'm very grateful that the military, the Army did their research, and they are now testing all new soldiers and putting in place to retest all the current soldiers. So now when the soldier who's been in the service, when they do their annual physical, they do blood work, right? And I've spoken with soldiers now that when I go to Camp Roberts, that they tell me, oh yeah, I've seen that on the screening, or they've heard about it, or they were tested and found out that they were carriers at the schoolhouse that I speak at. So the process is working, the awareness is there, and so I'm very grateful that the Army, I'm not saying that I'm a part of that, but I am a part of that, maybe not, I don't know, indirectly, but in my communication with the military and the doctors and the research that they were doing, I definitely, shared my story and shared my voice and for the last 15 years. So very grateful to see that the needle is moving towards sickle cell trait awareness. And with the last research that was done overseas in Europe, they've come to the conclusion that sickle cell trait is not benign. It is not benign. And one of the other reasons why this is about this silent killer is because the NCAA, college sports, college athletes have been collapsing and dying playing sports. And the parents didn't know, the school didn't know, no one paid attention, no one was aware. And so what the NCAA did in 2010, 2012 is they made it mandatory for all college athletes, D1, it went from D1 to D2 to D3. Now, today, all college athletes have to take a sickle cell trait test or sign a waiver, but the waiver is so that the school is not responsible if something happens to the athlete. It protects the school. So there's still conversations that need to be had with the parents and the athletes, even after they find out they're sickle cell trait carriers. Are they getting the information? Are they watching it on a video, right? When they find out they're trait carriers, they pull them in a room. Here's a pamphlet, here's a video. Now, if you're a college athlete, I'm not sure your attention span or how much you're paying attention or the importance of it, but it is important. And so there's still some conversations that are missing. And of course, as I was saying, the misdiagnosis and the emergency of it being written off as a heat stroke or poor conditioning because of the muscle cramps, because of the rhabdomyolysis of what that looks like, it could just appear to be a heat stroke. And the athlete is not getting the proper care that they need, because with the rhabdo over time, it can be fatal if not treated quickly, right? So some of the complications are sickle cell trait by themselves, and some of them are connected to rhabdomyolysis or heat stroke. But when you say heat stroke is the label, you got to peel off those layers and find out what caused the heat stroke, right? Because anybody can experience heat stroke, not just a sickle cell trait carrier, but we're more susceptible because of that red blood cell, that's the S trait, can mutate during overexertion. And if that red blood cell, that's the S trait, mutates, it sickles like a person with sickle cell anemia, and now there's no oxygen. So depending on what percentage of those red blood cells mutate with no oxygen getting to the muscles, is that what's triggering the rhabdo? Because the rhabdomyolysis is a skeletal muscular disorder, because there's no oxygen getting to the muscles, and the myoglobin and all the toxins break down into the bloodstream. And that triggers the renal failure, and then swelling in the limbs or the abdomen. And again, the kidneys can't filter all those toxins. So now you're having renal failure, you can have kidney damage, and worst case, the negative electrical charge in the body could trigger cardiac arrest. And so now the person is labeled as dying from cardiac arrest or dying from heat stroke. That's why it's the silent killer. And it can cause permanent damage or death. Now, I shared last week that it was 19 years last Sunday to the date of when I collapsed, and I'm still living with secondary. My body never recovered completely. I am living with secondary health complications with my sickle cell trait and the rhabdomyolysis, which causes skeletal, muscular, and joint damage. So I live in a pain 7. Right now, I'm here in Atlanta visiting my family, and my lower back is in pain, and so I'm at about a 8 right now, or a 9. I don't complain, but I'm in pain as I'm doing the show, and those are the secondary health complications that I live with, because maybe I was standing too long. I can't stand too long, and I can't sit too long. So yesterday I was playing pool with my family, and I didn't really sit, and I stood bending over, and so here I am. I had fun yesterday, but I'm paying for it today, and I'm on vacation, right? So there can be some serious health complications that can cause damage, permanent damage, and then in worst cases, sudden death. So again, it is so important for parents, student athletes, coaches, doctors, to ensure that they have this information. It is a public health issue. This is a public health issue. And so we don't want to minimize it. We want to make sure that people are aware and they're tested, right? So I'm going to play this PSA and come back, and then I got another part that I want to address around the public health issue and the information that needs to be shared, right? So again, this is the Farron Dozier Show on KCA Radio 106.5 FM, 10:50 a.m., and we're streaming from the KCA Red.com website, addressing sickle cell trait as the silent killer tonight. It is Sickle Cell Awareness Month, so shouts out to my sickle cell community. This is the month where the United States as a whole, people are doing conferences all around the country around sickle cell trait. For us, here in San Bernardino County, Fontana, especially, August is sickle cell trait prevention. So I get a jump start on it in August because I know that September is saturated with conversation. So in our community, August is sickle cell trait prevention month for the state of Fontana. Again, WDCONSCT.org or at WDC on Instagram and Twitter X. The Farron Dozier Show. Shout out, what's the count?
Do you remember studying sickle cell in biology class? What's the Count on Sickle Cell Trait Prevention is here to bring you awareness, education, and prevention conversations around the risk factors of this inherited gene. Visit WDCONSCT.org.
All right. Welcome back to the Farron Dozier Show on KCA Radio 106.5 FM, 10:50 a.m. That PSA right there about, do you remember sickle cell, learning about it in biology class? If you think back in biology class, yes, we do address sickle cell trait in the biology books because of the DNA. There's a couple of pages about it. However, it is very important. I've been able to go to schools, high schools, and talk about sickle cell trait with the biology classes. That is part of my high school tour that I've done before. And again, as I've been moving through these conversations, I'm actually going to start back up, going back into the high schools, junior high schools, colleges, and addressing sickle cell trait because it is taught in the books of biology. However, what better way to have someone who lives with that inherited gene that the students can read about it, the teachers can teach about it, and then allow us to come in and actually give our true life experiences with sickle cell trait and sickle cell disease or anemia. So I've done that in the past. The pandemic, I don't like to blame the pandemic, but the pandemic changed a lot of things today. So letting all that pass by and deal with, I'm going to start back up going into the high schools with the high school tour and dropping information with the biology classes and or the PE teachers and or with the athletic directors with all the different high school sports. As I mentioned, the NCAA is doing testing mandatory, but at the high school level, it's not mandatory. It's not something that, the high schools are really looking at unless you're playing sports and the physical has a question on it, are you a sickle cell trait carrier? And I believe today those physicals should have that question on there because of the level of college awareness. So it may trickle down, but again, if it's a question that you don't know, then how do you know to answer that question properly? So as I said before the break, it is a public health issue. The sickle cell trait education is minimal. Again, biology class, maybe health class. I spoke at the base a couple weeks ago, and one soldier had taken it, I think he's in anthropology or something in college. He was aware of it through that education. But again, many people don't even know that they were tested at birth, right? So depending on what state you were born in, you could have had a sickle cell trait test done at birth because they do now newborn screening. And depending on the state, it could have been, in the 1990s or maybe mid 1990s. You gotta find out. So I tell people if you're, over 30 years old, maybe 35, you may have not been screened. So that's a lot of people that may not have been screened in their state for newborn screening. So the public health conversation for me includes that. Going back and making sure that either you were screened or if you were screened and your parents forgot, you can remind them about the screening or you can remind them of this conversation. If you heard about it floating around that a cousin or your sister has it but you don't have it, you need to make sure. You need to make sure that this information is passed to your family members and your children and cousins and uncles, because if they're carriers, they could have a baby with sickle cell anemia or disease, or they could be having health complications and not realizing that those symptoms could be connected to sickle cell trait. But there are newborn screenings done. However, sometimes people forget, parents forget, right? So my story about that is my youngest daughter has a sickle cell trait. She was born in 98. I got the letter in the mail, looked at it, put it in the drawer because I didn't think anything of it. And then again, I didn't find out I was a carrier until 99. So she's born in 98. My test was done in 99, and I still didn't think about her test when she was born to look at or even pay attention, nor was it a conversation with my dad, God rest his soul, who was the trait carrier of where I got it from. And then his siblings and my cousins who are also sickle cell trait carriers, and one, Nigel, shouts out to Nigel, who has sickle cell anemia. So sometimes in the family, it doesn't get passed down as a conversation. I remember I was renting a car at Enterprise, and I still have the guy's phone number. He was the guy that helped me check out the car. And I brought it up about where I was going to speak at the base, and he remembered, oh, yeah, I have the sickle cell trait. My mom, she told me when I was a child, but I didn't realize it until I was in college. So these are real-life discussions that sometimes people don't remember until I have a conversation with them, or they know that they were, and then they don't know that there are symptoms. So as a public health issue, again, with athletics, especially with high school sports, all the way down to tiny mite football at any age of sports. It's not just football, it's basketball, it's soccer, it's hockey, it's boxing, it's marathon runners. All the sports are impacted by this if you are a trait carrier because of the exercise and the dehydration. So the public health issue is the sickle cell trait and the risk factors, and they're just not taught in schools, in sports programs, or the workplace, right? And I'm not saying it's not taught, but there's minimal conversation. So if you say, ask anybody about AIDS, the AIDS virus or HIV, the whole world knows about that. Right? So I want a campaign as such. But when you say sickle cell trait, people are like, oh yeah, man, that's a very important. It can cause sudden death. It's not just blacks. Multiple races have it. Like we want it to be that level of conversation. I don't know if I'm going to see that in my lifetime, but I've taken responsibility as a community statesman around health and safety, and I'm going to make sure I do my part until I leave the planet. So this conversation will not be done until I'm out, and my daughter and my grandson, I pray, my children will take it on, or I would have done my job, and I have written my name on the hearts of people. And so when they think about sickle cell trait, they'll remember my conversation, interacting, or they'll now hear it and pay attention to it more often and help disappear some of these topics. Again, with the public health issue, the more people that know about it, guess what? Now if somebody hears somebody talk about sickle cell trait in a conversation and they have some basic knowledge, they can make those corrections and start to disappear some of these myths and stigmas and guide people to more of a space to have an educated conversation. That's the part of the disappearing the ignorant, is getting the knowledge. That's the first piece for me. So being able to do that as a public health issue, I've done events around with public health, even with San Bernardino a couple of years back. I did an event, and we had the public health department come out and share why this is important. So again, I'm starting that back up again. So the different counties that are around San Bernardino, Riverside, Los Angeles County, Ventura County, I'm going to be reaching out to those public health departments so that we can start to have this conversation on a county level, right? And because of our basketball platform, the IE Hounds, the Inland Empire Hounds, and then with our other ABA basketball team, the Riverside County Mavericks, and then with our other ABA team, the Ventura County Orcas, that gives me 3 counties right there to address sickle cell trait and the risk factors and the public health issue, right? Can't deny it. It is a public health issue, again, especially around the athletic department, all right? So again, I'm going to come back, play this PSA, and then we'll get into the last part of this conversation. Again, this is very, very important, especially in our San Bernardino County area. The mixture of the races, the Latin community, the African-American community here, everybody's dating one another. We're having children, biracial children. And yes, just because you are Hispanic doesn't mean you may not have the sickle cell trait. You could also have that trait or another red blood cell condition that we'll talk about after this PSA right here. This is the Farron Dozier Show on KCA Radio. I'm live in Atlanta, Georgia, visiting my family. And of course, I'm dedicated, I'm consistent. This is my life work. So I made time tonight not to do a rerun, not to do I didn't do a pre-record. I could have pre-recorded the show. However, my family understands, and so it's 11:48 over here. So, yeah, we're live on the radio, KCA Radio, San Bernardino County, and thanks for listening. We'll be right back after this public service announcement. Shout out what's the count.
Muchos de nosotros nos vemos afectados por la enfermedad de células falciformes a diario y un número creciente simplemente no nos damos cuenta. Los impactos de esta enfermedad afectan a todas las personas y en especialmente a las personas de color y con antecedentes diversos. Estar en servicio conmigo y con los demás a medida que creamos una mayor conciencia sobre cómo identificar y dirigir el tratamiento de los rasgos de células falciformes y ayudar a las familias a saber cómo superar el trastorno de células falciformes. www.dsct.org. Gracias por su atención.
Again, welcome back to the Farron Dozier Show. That was our PSA in Espanol. Like I said, it is very important. This is Hispanic Heritage Month, so that conversation is fitting. And again, You could be Caucasian, Mediterranean, Asian descent, African American, and Hispanic is number 2. We're number 1 as African Americans because of Africa, continent, the area, because of malaria present, right? So that's why we're number 1, because of our population, and the body created that defective gene, and that's how my ancestors were able to survive malaria. Because if you've got malaria without the trait and any defense mechanism, you can die because the malaria attacks the red blood cells, right, from the parasites, from mosquitoes, right? So there are other red blood cell conditions out there, like thalassemia trait, C trait, D trait, OARAB, that your ancestors carried to combat the malaria in your parts of the country. So depending on where your ancestors are from and their malaria was present, like the Asian descent, they have thalassemia traits to combat their malaria. However, they have people in their community that are born with thalassemia disease, right? So you replace sickle cell traits, and now you can talk about the same conversation I'm having tonight with you is a conversation that they have about thalassemia, because if both parents have thalassemia traits, they pass that to the child has a type of alpha or beta thalassemia disease, usually beta thalassemia, minor, major, depending on the thalassemia, right? So you can have people who have C trait disease, D trait disease, because both parents have the D trait. Like, we're not the only ones in our culture, in our nationality, in our races that have these type of red blood cell conditions. Ours are largely popular because, again, of the African descent and the malaria. But the Mediterranean, the Asians, the Hispanics can have sickle cell trait because we're not far from the black community. You can have C trait, you can have thalassemia trait. It just depends on where your ancestors are also from when you go back and look at your bloodline. So it's not a skin color conversation, it is a bloodline. And the only way you can find out if you're a sickle cell trait carrier is having the hemoglobin electrophoresis test done. That's the blood work. And you might, no, I'm not going to say you might, and you want to have a CBC, because when you do your sickle cell trait hemoglobin electrophoresis test, it's going to give you a panel, and it will show you your A, your S, and your A2 percentage. And if there's another inherited gene like C, D, E, all that will show up in that panel of the electrophoresis. And then so you want to do a CBC, a complete blood count, to match up with the hemoglobin electrophoresis. So when your doctor does your genetic counseling, you can have all your blood work current, and now they can give you some information of what they see as far as your blood work, combining the two documents. I recommend that since I've been an advocate, right? So the last piece of this conversation is a stigma or myth, and people with sickle cell trait in the carrier status, they say it doesn't cause harm. That's one of the first myths, which is not true. The other fear that's a real conversation in the world is the fear of being discriminated against. And that's really why around sports and jobs like being a flight attendant or being in a certain military skills jobs, because you may not be able to do certain jobs because of the elevation or that skill that it takes, right? So underwater, scuba diving, welders, that might not be the job for you because you can have issues with your spleen because of the lack of oxygen. So there are things that we have to be aware of, but also the fear that if I have the sickle cell trait, that I could be discriminated against because of my trait status. And that's something, it is a real conversation because we, as a black community, the stories around the world systems that we live in, discrimination is something that we deal with. But I believe that we all deal with some level of discrimination. But when you actually talk to people with sickle cell trait, or you talk to athletes or military people that are sickle cell trait carriers, and you talk to their peers, well, guess what? The athletes want to know that their coach, that their player, that their quarterback, that their person on their team is a trait carrier. So guess what? So they can look out for them. So it's not always that it's a negative thing about being discriminated against. It helps move the conversation forward, right? And if you can't play a sport because you're a sickle cell trait carrier, then guess what? You're not doomed. There are 40,000 other jobs that you can do. There's jobs with with sports teams that you can get a job with. You may not be the person catching the pass or shooting the jumper on the court. Maybe you could get another job that keeps you connected to the sport. As I now am the owner of 3 basketball teams in the American Basketball Association with the red, white, and blue basketball. I can't play ball like I used to, but guess what? I'm connected to sports, and that helps me. It helps my identity. It helps me stay connected to the basketball world. So there's nothing wrong with you if you're a trait carrier. It's just making sure that you know your status and your health. But discrimination, yes, it can be an issue because we see it all the time in society. We talk about it even today, about people being discriminated against, and especially not for an inherited gene that you were born with, right? So this was my conversation tonight around sickle cell trait and the silent killer. Again, the silent continues because the talking about sickle cell trait might impact relationships, marriage choices, and athletic careers. That's why it's a public health issue, because 96% of the women who have had babies with sickle cell didn't know that their partner or they were carriers, right? So now we're talking about relationships and getting married and having the choice to have a child with sickle cell versus at the after effect of it. All right, so again, more information, WDCONSCT.org. Reach out to me at Farron Dozier if you want to be a guest and share your sickle cell trait or sickle cell story. I'll be coming back next week with more topics for the next 17 or however many weeks left till December. So I appreciate you for listening in. FarronD.com for more information about what I'm up to, and then WDCONSCT.org. Shout out Worcester County. Thank you.
KC